Hello everyone, hope you guys are doing well and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about wealth and explore the two economic inequalities in our world. With that stated, let's get started. Wealth by Woojin Cho. Here are the table of contents. We're going to be discussing what wealth is, going over wealth inequality as well as income inequality, and we're going to be ending with talking about possible solutions. So, what is wealth? Wealth is the abundance of valuable assets owned by a person. Wealth can be measured by subtracting liabilities from assets, and assets are something that provide current or future economic benefit. Assets include shares of stock, real estate, and even your computer. They're all considered assets because it's a resource that can be converted into cash. Liabilities are something that you owe to another entity. Examples include your utility bill, money paid to employees, and your mortgage bill. Wealth is often interchanged with net worth or capital, so when I use the word net worth or capital, just remember that I'm referring to wealth. In a society, wealth achieves two things, which are 1. Provide housing, and 2. Serving as a factor of production and producing other goods and services. Wealth hasn't disappeared, as it serves utility and due to technology. Technology uses lots of capital, and since capital has many use cases, you can accumulate it without reducing the return to zero. So as long as wealth serves its utility, it will remain an integral part of our society. And looking at a macro level, economists use gross domestic product, also known as GDP, to measure the nation's wealth. Gross domestic product is the monetary value of all finished goods and services made within a country. This is why oftentimes you will hear on the news that high GDP is correlated with a healthy economy. However, it's important to understand that GDP ignores inequality and only measures income. Measures of well-being, poverty, and pollution aren't accounted for by the GDP, and that's why it's important to look at other indexes. In rich countries, wealth is divided into two main parts, which is real estate and financial assets. Financial assets include stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and long-term financial contracts such as annuities and pension funds. Let's give an example to practice whether we understand how to measure wealth. So here's Johnny. Johnny has a $500,000 house, $100,000 in cash and savings, and operates a business evaluated at around $400,000. Johnny also has mortgages and business loans that account for $200,000. What is his total wealth? Feel free to pause right now, try to figure it out, and resume after you got it. So, first, we need to identify Johnny's assets, which in the case includes house, cash and savings, and business. Adding these categories, which is $500,000 plus $100,000 plus $400,000, we get $1 million. And now we look at liabilities, which is the money he owes. This would be the mortgage and debt, which is worth at $200,000. So we take the assets and subtract it by liabilities, which gives us $800,000. 100,000 minus 200,000 gives us $800,000. And this is Johnny's net worth. As long as assets are greater than liabilities, you have strong wealth. And with wealth spurs economic growth and provides a strong incentive for people like Johnny living inside a society to innovate and work. So now we're going to be discussing two different types of economic inequality: wealth inequality and income inequality. Wealth inequality deals with how assets are distributed, whereas income inequality focuses on how earnings are distributed. Income inequality deals with labor inequality and income from capital. And in general, inequality with respect to capital is higher than inequality earned from labor. And before we talk about wealth inequality, we have to talk about wealth illusion as well as the different wealth classes. For millions of people, wealth is a little more than a few weeks' wage in a checking account. Wealth is so concentrated that a large chunk of society are unaware of its existence and imagine that it belongs to some surreal or mysterious body. I want to challenge this thinking, as it's much more than just savings. Wealthy people are real, and they continue to build instruments to gain more and more wealth. Before we get into the numbers, the four classes. So we have the top 1%. This is the group where income from capital becomes progressively more and more important. The upper 9% is the group of people where income from labor predominates. So Jobs of the upper 9% includes doctors, lawyers, merchants, restaurateur, and other self-employed entrepreneurs. The top decile lives in two different worlds. In the upper 9% group, income from labor prevails, whereas the top 1%, labor from capital, is predominant. And we'll talk more about what this income from capital is. The middle 50 to 90%. The middle class owns around 35% of nation's wealth, generally, and the poorest 50%, they own less than 5% of nation's wealth. The 90% of households not in the top 10% usually relies heavily on labor income. And I want to show you guys the asset representation of these groups to get a better understanding. So, right now, we're looking at a Federal Reserve data sheet, assets by wealth percentile group in 2021 in Q3. So this is the latest results, and I'll make sure to leave this link in the description for you guys to look at. But feel free to pause the video right now to make some observations about these different groups. This is the top 1%, this is the upper 9%, this is the 50 to 90% middle, and this is the bottom 50%. What do you guys see? Okay. I'm sure that you guys noticed that corporate equities and mutual fund shares is drastically much more dominant in the top 1%. As we discussed earlier, income from capital is predominant in the top 1%. Real estate stake is minimal, and they are heavily invested into corporate equities and private businesses. You see private businesses in the top 1% is 18.1%, and then the mutual fund and equities is at whopping 48.3%, whereas the bottom 50%, corporate equities and mutual fund barely account to anything, 2.9%, and private businesses, it's merely almost 2%. So this drastic difference is what creates the wealth gap. In addition, from the data from the Federal Reserve, the top 1% gained more than $6.5 trillion in corporate equities and mutual fund shares during the COVID pandemic. And CNBC reported that the top 10% currently owns 89% of all US stocks, which is alarming. So for the majority of people, housing is the favorite investment vehicle of the middle class, to be particular. But true wealth always consists of financial and business assets, as we can see. Now, let's talk about this infographic that I've created. It's going to be a little hard to see, but I'm going to zoom in. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see it. I know it looks a little bit blurry, but work with me here. Let's first talk about how much wealth these classes have by looking at the dollar amount. Looking at this graph, the yellow bar represents 1991 wealth, whereas the gray bar represents the 2021 household wealth from the Federal Reserve. I couldn't fit the numbers on the y-axis, but I hope you can see the inequality. In 2021, which is this gray bar, the top 1% owned $44 trillion. So this represents $44 trillion. The upper 9% held $51 trillion. So the second gray, $51 trillion. The middle 50 to 90% had $38 trillion. And the bottom 50% had around $3 trillion, which is roughly 16 times less than the wealth at top 1%. So from this graph, we can see the effect of inflation from 1991 to 2021. And if you guys don't know what inflation is, it's the rise in the price level of goods and services within an economy. Another thing that I want to point out, although it could be kind of hard to notice, is the difference between the upper 10% and the bottom 50%. So in 1991, we could see that between the middle 50 to 90% and upper 9%, it's almost leveled out. But in 2021, look at how that gap has drastically changed over merely just 30 years. And this is alarming because the emergence of middle class is still a historical innovation, a recent one, because in the past, wealth was heavily concentrated to the top upper class. According to economist Piketty, the upper class owns around 60% of Europe's wealth and 70% in the US. This stake was more skewed in the past. The rise of the middle class landed a few crumbs, which led them to account for 1/3 of Europe's wealth and around a quarter for the US. Isn't that amazing? Although the share is disproportionate, this change is quite revolutionary. The emergence of the class kind of shifted the lifestyles for the middle class. More opportunities, the right to education, and so on. It's not only more moral, but also it's more profitable to rely on study, work, and professional success. For the first time in history, one can live better by obtaining a job at the top percentile rather than inheritance. Study, work, and talent is paid better than inheritance. So, I think that's a huge win for if we look at humanity as a whole, or a society as a whole. Although there are problems with this meritocratic society, which seeks to justify domination based on justice, virtue, and merit, to say nothing to insufficient productivity at the bottom, it gives more opportunity than living under an aristocracy, where a few individuals chosen by genetic or family history rules the nation. Don't you guys think? Let me know. So now, onto the percentages. So if we scroll down a little bit, we could look at the exact percentages of each group. In 2021, the top 1% owned 32.1% of nation's wealth. The top 9% owned 37.5% of the wealth. The middle 50 to 90 owned 27.9%. The bottom 50% accounted only for 2.5%. Do you guys see how the majority of people are unaware of how wealth is? It really does seem like an illusion looking at how little their stake is. And here's a pie chart looking at it in a different perspective. This is the 3%. And if I could restate the numbers into a real life scenario, let's say that there's 100 people. We then rank them from wealthiest to poorest in ascending order. So we're going to be distributing the apples. The first person gets 32 apples. This is the richest. And then the next 9 people earns 4 apples each. And then the 40 people following gets 7/10 of an apple. And do you know what the rest of the 50 people get? They get 5/100th of an apple. So I hope that makes a little better sense. So let's say we have 100 apples, right? And there's 4 different groups. The top 1%, the upper 9%, the middle 50 to 90%, and then we also have the bottom 50%, right? So one person, this is the top 1%, they get 32 apples. And then the next 9 people, they get 4 apples each. So even at the top decile, there's a huge drastic change. 32 apples per one person drop down to 4 apples. But then the next 40 people, this is the bottom, this is the middle 50 to 90%, they get 7/10 of an apple. So not even a full apple. And then the rest 50% of the people, the bottom 50%, they get 5/100th of an apple. So I hope that puts into perspective and makes better sense. And this last infographic over here, if you can see, this shows the shares of families and how lack of investing kind of hurts families. The wealthier gets wealthier, as investing in the stock market has around 7 to 10% yearly returns, which outpaces inflation. And as we have stated, the top 1% is heavily invested into financial assets, whereas the bottom 50%, it's standing at 0%. That's quite alarming, isn't it? All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this infographic, and now let's turn our attention back to the slides. So, income inequality. Income inequality is the uneven distribution of new earnings in a single economy. Inequality of income comes between inequality of labor and capital. Income inequality exists in all economies, and although the top decile takes a larger portion of each year's output, it isn't significant enough for a revolution to occur. But if it did, then most likely there would be some frustration, and most likely the system would change. The collapse of the top percentile is largely in part due to the fall of top capital, such as world wars, public policy, and the Great Depression. These type of events were one of the reasons how the middle income kind of emerged. But financial crisis does not really end structural increase of inequality, because inequality occurs in part from the design of capitalism itself. Capital makes more money for capitalists, and it's a self-perpetuating circle. Currently, we live in a meritocratic society where the peak of income is dominated by high forms from labor rather than inherited wealth. We move from a society of rentiers to a society of managers. So let's talk about CEOs. CEOs are getting more because their power is to set pay, because much of their pay is stock related, not because they are increasing their productivity and high demand skills. From 1978 to 2020, the compensation of the top CEOs increased from 1,322% from 1978 to 2020. In 2020 alone, CEOs of top 350 firms made $24.2 million on average, which is 351 times more than a typical worker. Do you guys think that CEOs deserve to be paid 351 times more than a typical worker? This overperformance of the top centile explains the top decile share of the US national income as a whole. The wage inequality in the US and Europe is highly linked to the increased pay at the very top of the spectrum, but not only at the top 1%, but even more at the 0.01%. And the 0.01% include billionaires congregating in cities such as Tokyo, Paris, London, New York, San Francisco, and many, many others. And America itself, I believe we have around 800 billion billionaires, which is just mind-blowing. I'm not stating that these people don't deserve to be compensated so largely, by any means, because they move the world through exploring beautiful ideas. What's alarming here, for me, is when you're being compensated based upon your power to set pay instead of skill or productivity, that's a problem. It's a problem when the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of economy. And since the 1980s, the pay gap between college graduates and those who go no further than high school has increased. According to Pew Research Center, millennials with a college graduate earns 38% more than millennials who's just a high school graduate. There's a strong correlation between income and education, and workers' productivity really depends upon the skills and how valuable that skill is in society. So, the takeaway. The largest fortunes are best indexed and most diversified over the long run, and smaller fortunes like checking and saving accounts are hurt by inflation. In the past, growth was expected to grow solely by increasing outputs. Think about the Industrial Revolution and heavy adoption of manufacturing. But with more data, we now know that long-term structural growth is possible due to productivity growth, along with the diffusion of knowledge. We live in an information era where education is heavily valued and where the majority of population have access to learn. Although there is no one sole answer to fixing inequality, I want to share some possible policy changes that economists have proposed. 1. Increasing minimum wage. This will alleviate people out of poverty. 2. Increase earned income tax. 3. Build assets for working families. This could be Roth IRAs and pension funds. 4. Invest in education. We saw the correlation between high school graduates and college graduates. This one's really important. 5. Make tax code more progressive. So the more you make, the higher your taxes are. 6. End residential segregation. In the long run, the best way to reduce inequities with respect to labor is to invest in education as it equips skills. And in the US, in 1980s, wage inequality was associated due to failure in investing sufficiently in higher education. And personally, out of these policies, I really value education. Learning has literally changed my life for the better, and I know that everyone deep inside has a curiosity that just needs a little spark. And real change comes not from external forces, but from the desire to change. The only real revolution occurs right inside you. With that said, I want to share a quote from Nelson Mandela. As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persists in our world, none of us can truly rest. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation. And once again, thank you guys so much for your interest in learning. And I hope you guys start pondering about this world that we currently reside in and where you guys want to head to. With that said, thank you once again, and I'll talk to you really soon. Peace.